I would now like to introduce today's presenters. First, we have Tom Riley, partner, who leads the Beaconfield Partners Advisory Firm here in ANZ, helping public and private sector organizations get the most out of technology services and business services investments. Next, we have Abhishek Sharma, partner, who leads Everest Group's pricing assurance practice and assists clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and sourcing cost rationalization. And we also have Amy Fong, Vice President, who leads the firm's offerings for sourcing and vendor management teams, including market intelligence and price benchmarking, memberships, and custom research. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Tom.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone to this Beaconfield Partners and Everest Group webinar. As we start the webinar, I'd just like to first off call out the recent partnership between Beaconfield and Everest Group. As many of you know, Everest Group is a global leader in ICT and business service research, and certainly is no stranger to the ANZ region. What this partnership does for Everest, however, is give them additional local support through Beaconfield for their clients here in the region. And for us at Beaconfield, this partnership brings us a lot of really valuable insight that we can use to augment the work that we're already doing here today. For those of you that don't know Beaconfield, we are a commercial advisory firm that is squarely focused on ICT and business services consulting in Australia, New Zealand. Our services include the three things that you see on the slide now. So we do benchmarking and assurance, commercial advisory and sourcing, and program turnaround and delivery. And especially when that program turnaround and delivery, it involves working with a vendor to help either things get back on track or help deliver against a contract. We are in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth, and we fly in everywhere else, fly in and out everywhere else in the region. And our client base is about 80% state and local government, including all of the states and a lot of the local governments. And the rest of our work is essentially the ASX 200, and we work in retail, financial services, transport, energy, resources, and a number of other segments. In these difficult times, what we've seen in Australia and New Zealand is a real challenge to global supply chains. And of course, that's not just limited to the things that we're buying on Amazon and Catch and to the the manufacturers and distributors of goods, but that also extends to the technology services and business process outsourcing support that we all get. We've all become very used to working globally and to working with some offshore component to a lot of the work that we do. In the last few months at Beaconfield, we've spent a lot of time helping clients restructure and renegotiate contracts, both in terms of pricing and performance, and of course, helping people with emergency procurement. And now the focus is really on helping our clients get their projects and their procurement pipeline back on track. Based on what we were seeing, we thought it would be a good idea to give you a little bit of insight from Everest into what they're seeing globally related to service provider contracting and pricing. And we think that has a lot of implications for us here locally. So with that, I think this is a very exciting topic for today's webinar. We're thankful that you've had the time to join. Obviously, for any of your colleagues that want to watch this on a replay, that will also be available. And we're hoping to host another series of webinars in the coming months. And with that, I will hand it over to Amy Fong from Everest Group.
Thank you, Tom. We are very excited to be working with Beaconfield Partners and really enjoyed getting to know everyone and the expertise that you offer to the ANZ market. So I'm going to kick this off today with a bit of a context setting, and we're going to focus in this webinar on some of the areas that we see people overpaying in services agreements, and some of the timing and the changes that we're seeing as a result of COVID-19 cost pressures. We'll talk a little bit more about negotiating on pricing. Abhishek is the expert on this, and we'll go very deep into some of his advice. And we'll talk about some of the win-win levers as well. Just for everybody to understand Everest Group's background, we have a deep database of sole source and competitive deals and advisory experience that we pull from and that we use for these kind of events. You'll see quite a bit of research that we've done, primary research. We have perspectives from the contracts, the clients that we work with, mid-tenure contracts, as well as strategic engagement reviews. And we have discussions with enterprise strategic outsourcing stakeholders and procurement teams, IT teams all the time. So all of that kind of bubbles up to this conversation. So we're going to start out with, as I said, context setting and where we are now. Then I'll hand it off to Abhishek to talk about some of the opportunities and the optimization side versus structural change. And then we're going to open it up for questions at the end. So as Amanda has in the chat there, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will respond to them, or the chat box, and we'll respond to them at the end or as we go. Would love to hear what's on your mind as well. So where are we right now? What did we learn from COVID? I'm sure all of us around the world in many different locations, we're all affected by COVID and in different ways, right? But some of the commonalities that we've seen across locations, across companies, across service providers is that first of all, we did figure out remote delivery fairly quickly. We say eventually. I would say in the service provider realm, most of the big service providers were up and running within 2 to 3 weeks from what was an entirely on-site situation to remote delivery. So although it was a little rocky, as an industry, we saw quick bounce back and a lot of flexibility that we may not have anticipated before. The operating model really got exposed at the board level, right? There is pressure at every level to improve on the operating model, and we saw where all the holes are, right? Where are all the flaws? Enterprises, or most enterprises, have kind of moved to this recession mindset, right? Regardless of where you are and what the stock market's doing, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. Cities and states and provinces are going in and out of lockdown or quarantine or restriction type modes. So there's still quite a bit of recessionary mindset out there around the world. And then the C-suite in general, at the top of organizations, are looking for structural changes. So, I think a couple weeks into COVID, we all knew that this wasn't a short-term thing, and we started to see that this was going to be longer. And we needed to fill some of those holes and close some of the gaps that we saw in the operating models. So that kind of brings us to where we are now. We talked about that first thing, which is the first stage. We viewed it as kind of a work from home scramble. Let's figure out how we get everything in place and keep the show running. There was a fear in a lot of areas around resource continuity planning. What if 70% of my workforce goes out because they're sick or they're caring for sick family members and loved ones? How do we keep things running? And there are some parts of the world where that happened, certainly in certain industries in the US. But overall, that was a little bit less of a concern than I think it could have been. But ultimately, where we ended up was this parallel path of cost takeout, and organizations needing to respond to budget crunch situation or new goals. We call it a budget cliff, and resetting to the next normal. So now we need to think about, what does our service provider model look like in a variety of different ways? And what we've seen is organizations really facing both of those challenges in parallel. There's some common goals that we all have. So we need to dramatically reduce costs. We learned that our risks were exposed. So how do we lower our risk exposure in the future? How do we increase productivity at the same time to overcome that budget cliff? And what that means is essentially all options are on the table. And some of these options feel like they're a little contradicting, right? Do we want more providers in our portfolio to have more competition and reduce costs, or do we want to have fewer so we're lowering our risk, or does that increase our risk? Do we really need more? Right, back and forth. Do we want to do things more locally? Do we need to be, a bit more onshore? Do we need to look at having a third party do something that we may have done? Automation and simplification versus minimizing cost controls. Automation has been highlighted as important, but it takes investment at the same time. So we find that most of the organizations we work with are battling these opposing decisions and essentially making really big decisions that change the shape of their portfolio and their sourcing strategy. So when we look at our research, what we found was pretty early on that most organizations had already moved into cost cutting mode. When we ask about the next normal, as we like to call it, or returning to business as usual, and the interesting thing about that is that we're all in different phases right now, right? Some of us in some parts of the US are returned to normal, and others of us are still in sheltering in place. And in Australia, I think it's the same, and different countries in different phases. But I think the overall perspective of what are you going to do to prepare for the next normal was pretty consistent. When we look at choices around workforce flexibility, reining in operational costs, updating business continuity and risk-related planning, and cutting external spend. I mean, more than 50% of companies, 75 in some cases, were putting a significant effort into those things. And all of those are large, big shifts for those organizations. So I want to take a pause here and open up a poll. And the question we'd like to hear from all of you, it's always great to hear who's on the phone and who's on the line and where you are, is what are the biggest opportunities for your organization? So when you think about your services, is it high bill rates and rollover skilling? Is it poor third-party leverage, doing too much in-house, inadequate continuous improvement expectations, correcting embedded terms like inflation or currency, or is it obsolete solutions and technology? And you can vote for as many of these as you think are a challenge. And we're just going to give it enough time for everybody to put their vote, so we've got a quorum here. Interesting. Oh, the results of these are always really interesting. I don't want to put my finger on the scale while the voting's still happening. So this is a really strong on the middle and the last one. Inadequate continuous improvement expectations and obsolete solutions and technology. That's super interesting. That to me says that organizations are looking to transform or have their service providers drive, if not transformative, significant improvement, and it's not happening, or it's not at the level that you want it to be. And then I think the top two, bill rates and overskilling and third-party leverage, those are things we're going to definitely talk about tonight. That we think that there's a huge opportunity. So with that, I am going to turn it to Abhishek, who, as I said, is our resident expert and partner from a pricing assurance perspective, and can jump into the next piece here.
Sure, thanks, Amy. So the results of the quick poll, we just held, threw up some interesting thoughts, and that wasn't really surprising as to what we see in the market, because a lot of clients who we speak with, really tell that they can see that there's some gap that they need to cover, but really, how do those mechanics work, right? And how to really bridge that gap? What really are those priority opportunities that you need to look at, right? If you go to the next page, before we kind of get into some of those opportunities, which we'll talk about, some of those levers, right? It's some of our convictions based on conversations in the market and based on the clients we've served. We just want to recap them. The first is that there's a budget cliff, right, which is here, faster and steeper than expected. This year, a lot of things have continued. There was a bit of a gap due to COVID, but let's not forget that there were budgets which were actually signed off perhaps very early part of this year or last year. Right? So there's already a budgeting process in place where some things could have been stalled, but then again, it was all set. Now the budgets which are going to be set are bearing in mind the uncertainties of the COVID, right? And clearly, there's a significant pathway ahead. Smart leaders are actually using the crisis to what we call rip off the band-aid. Now, there's a lot of, I personally believe that in large organizations, even mid-sized, a lot of resistance to initiatives, resistance to transformation comes in because the business is going great and people don't want to upset the apple cart. Right? And nobody wants to antagonize a particular set of people because they say, hey, let's not bother about $2 million of savings. Well, this business unit is getting $150 million, right? It's not. But as soon as the going gets bad, that's when the time is when everyone is all ears to really look at how to really drive efficiency. So a lot of this is happening. In relation to the last line item on the poll, investments in digital and modernization will increase rapidly, and that's a good sign because many times service providers can't bring in that level of automation or technology modernization because the client organization themselves, are pretty behind in adopting digital. Everything's on the table, and by everything we mean everything, because whenever there's a cost pressure of the magnitude that we are seeing currently, clearly, as you'll see in the subsequent slides, just a simple rate benchmark and simple rate movement for services would really help a lot, right? So that's why you've got to look at multiple things, which we're just going to talk about. And then finally, the window for change will be measured in months, not quarters. So expect very fast decision making, especially when it comes to some of these cost reduction and efficiency improvement initiatives.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. All great points. And I think when we look at this, and I have more of the sourcing and procurement background, having worked with a lot of different spend categories, the services area is particularly interesting to me. And one of the reasons I came to Everest Group actually a while back, in that there's so much leakage in the values of these portfolios, right? So contracts tend to have a lot of gaps, not great third-party leverage, overskilling of roles. We'll talk a little bit more about that. High bill rates, skill premiums, as we mentioned earlier, inadequate continuous improvement expectations, embedded terms like inflation, currency, tax, cost of living, various terms that are in the contract that tend to be in favor of the service providers. And then, of course, obsolete solutions and technology. We talked about that, but in every portfolio review we perform, some of these issues come up, and it seems like an area, or it is an area where there's just a unequal or non-bilateral information between the buyers and the service providers. So that's why we thought this topic was especially interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so as we get into some of the levers, which I'll just talk about, thanks, Emmy. One of the very topical themes which comes up is, hey, work from home. What's the work from home cost impact? We expect that because they can let go of their expensive real estate, whether in India or elsewhere, they should pass on the benefits. Right? Now, one thing which needs to be kept in mind is that work from home doesn't mean an immediate reduction in all infrastructure costs for service providers, right? So this should be used rather carefully as a negotiation lever because there's rather multiple factors at play here. Now, there's some factors which are now stabilizing, but eventually, it's taken a while for them to level out. For example, the additional costs of providing laptops, providing VPN connectivity, additional network costs, to people. Bear in mind that in a lot of countries, fast broadband needed for services is not easily available in everyone's home. Right? So that actually has led to an increase in cost for the service provider, and also leases cannot be stopped. These are long-term leases in expensive locations in every country. they cannot just be switched off within a couple of months, right? So it's just now, after 6 to 7 months, that service providers are looking at how to optimize some of that. But we don't see any reason for an immediate reduction. But again, there are factors which lead to a decrease in cost reduction. There's lower electricity, internet bandwidth costs for the office, real estate, etc. And then, of course, in certain locations, there are transport-related expenses which the companies pick up, which are now not being around. Right? So, in the short term, till now we've seen actually service provider costs either go up, stay stagnant, or overall the tilt is towards higher degree of costs. We do expect that over the medium term, coupled with currency depreciation, etc., this could cause the delivery cost to go down by 3 to 5%. But instantaneous expectation of passing on that benefit may be a foregone conclusion. Now, if we were to kind of look at another aspect, which is very thematic, contemporary, on the next page, we mentioned the theme around budget cliff, right? It's actually seen in different shapes and forms, right? But in the past 6 months, what's happened is that many enterprises have used, some for the very right reasons, some just hopping onto the bandwagon, elements around, hey, I need a discount because we're in bad economic shape. Now, effectively, what we've seen is that many discussions have hovered around a straight 10 to 15%, even 18 to 20% in some cases, discount using the margin differential as justification. Right? So the clear thought being, hey, you can afford it because, hey, Mr. Service Provider, you have a higher margin, much higher margin than us, so you have that leeway to give it to us, right? Now, while it may work for some cases, very rare, right? It'll definitely not work for all. Right? Simple reason being that you cannot expect the same kind of service, everything remains the same, just for a direct 15 to 20% cost reduction, because it just won't work. Now, where an enterprise can sustainably get to is a function of also where the starting point is. The main issue with simply asking for a 10 to 15% straight off discount is that many enterprises have not really seen what the current status of that contract is. I mean, if as compared to the market, the provider is charging 35%, then hey, 35% more, then 10 to 15% is minuscule. You should target way more. But if you're already at the very least edge of cutthroat pricing, there is no way anyone can give another 15% straight discount without harming either the relationship or cutting corners or both. So that's what our view is, that so a level of prioritization is absolutely critical. And then any fee reduction should be anchored around some of the win-win themes, which also help the provider cut down delivery costs, right? Because it's an ongoing relationship. It's not about a simple 3 to 4 or 5 months and then we'll see where that takes out. Right? So that's why the subsequent slides will discuss some of these to drive common objectives. Now, the waterfall chart that you see here is unique, right? Because the red dotted line comment is where, unfortunately, a lot of the effort goes from enterprises, right? Unit costs, where we look at rate cards, let's say developer cost in India, senior tester cost in Australia, for example, right? They often contribute to only about 5% of the total savings potential. Okay, service providers have gained the art of rate benchmarking, honestly, because many times what they'll do is they'll keep the service rates within the market rates, within competitive, but then it's the other elements which actually cause a lot of value leakage, right? So what exactly are they? Some of those are pretty straight, right? Right sizing and right shoring. It could be, hey, do you have more people than what's necessary? Equitable contract terms and conditions, right? We'll talk about some of these, like the cost of living adjustment, foreign exchange, etc. Is that skewed towards the provider? SLA commitments, right? We have another page subsequently, which I'll talk about in a minute. Nothing really comes for free, right? So just by targeting extremely stringent SLAs in one way or the other, the client is paying for that, right? So some of these are evolutionary tactics which need to be taken into account. Having said that, right, there's also another set which is towards the far right of this graphic, right, which is around, again, what's the automation impact? How much has DevOps been adopted? Like, What's the self-service impact? And what are some of those transformational elements, which for some reason, it could be the provider, it could be the client hesitance to change, have just really not been brought in. So from a total cost of ownership perspective, these can offer way more benefit, right? They're tougher to implement, but these can offer significantly higher order of magnitude of benefit, as compared to just looking at a rate per mechanism. In terms of specific areas, right, within the services landscape, on the next page, we're basically seeing one of the elements is around IT infrastructure pricing. Just to take an example, right? Now that has declined significantly in the past 2 years, and we see many enterprises still paying the same old high rates, right? The impact actually gets amplified because infrastructure is often a major spend area, so the scale factor makes the hit even more. Our recommendation, honestly, would be for every enterprise, at least for IT infrastructure, to objectively review their infrastructure rates once every, ideally 18 to 24 months, but at least once every 24 to 30 months. Right? Now, while this is actually about base rates, the story doesn't end here. Right? On the next page, we'll speak about another aspect where I have a favorite term which I use. Skill premium inertia. Now, what really is that about? Now, once a hot skill doesn't really mean that it's always a hot skill. Right? Now, a phenomenon, what we consistently observe is what I like to call, as I mentioned, skill premium inertia, right? So that's when a premium agreed at a certain point in time. Let's assume, a client and provider have agreed in 2017 that a certain skill demands a certain kind of premium over and above the rates that they have, which could be fair due to the demand supply conditions at that time. Now, skills like S4HANA, RPA, ETL, they've actually come down significantly over the past 2 to 3 years. So it's critical to maintain a look at these skill premiums throughout the contract tenure and keep on recalibrating it. Unfortunately, it's all in the hands of enterprises to be able to track this, to be able to monitor this with a real hawkeye to make sure that they don't keep on continuing these, paying these high rates, because service providers are rarely going to come back and say, well, it's the premium isn't now 20%, it's just 12%. It's never going to be the case. So that's really important, and it's not even so. The savings which some of our clients have achieved by following this approach, really keeping a track of it, they're not insignificant. Right? They can easily run into hundreds of thousands of dollars each year, which is way more important in today's times than maybe it used to be considered a couple of years ago. So again, critical to really look at some of these elements which tend to be hidden behind the facade of pure rates. I think we have time for another poll, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek. Great points on that. I always like talking about some of these areas. Let's ask the second poll. What levels of effective rate changes are you targeting? I'm guessing that most of you are on this call because you're trying to save money somewhere and you buy services. So we would love to hear, if you have a target savings range, 0 to 3, 4 to 8, 9 to 13, 14 to 19, and 20+%. Just go ahead and hit one of those, and then we will close it out. Wow, 9 to 13% for most of you, almost 70%. That is significant, and that's good to hear, I guess. A lot of opportunity, I'm sure, and that probably. Abhishek, any thoughts on that? Does that sound in line with what you're seeing in the market right now?
Yeah, I guess yes, because 9 to 13% in my mind falls right at the sweet spot of something which is material, but also not something which will really kill the supplier's profitability, right? So yeah, I think that's a fair balance for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a good target to have, given a lot of the things we've talked about here. So let's jump into the next section, and I think Abhishek's talked a lot about where the opportunities are. We want to talk a little bit more about optimization versus structural change. And from some of the answers in that first poll, it sounds like many of you are looking for, you know, a little bit improvement optimization, but a lot of structural change as well around technologies and things like that. So let's talk about that. When we look at, you know, all of the various levers we have to drive costs, we kind of look at it in two ways. On the left, we have direct negotiated cost impact levers, and we covered a lot of these in the previous few slides. You know, do we negotiate for lower rate cards? Look at some of the skill premiums and try to take those out. Look for fee waivers and inflation impact waivers and things like that. That may be more short term. They certainly help us get to that, you know, 10% target or whatever it may be. But they're not as win-win, and they're not necessarily as long term. On the left, or sorry, on the right, we have indirect win-win cost impact levers, and these tend to be more structural changes. So calibrating your service credit regime, or giving access in the spend portfolio, preferred access, increasing automation. Again, that was a big one for a lot of you on the line. Looking at different resource delivery models. So how do we really change the structure in ways that benefit both parties and aren't just, you know, giving the providers a haircut to achieve longer term cost savings that don't impact your service providers' margins as much. And I like to talk about this section. You know, coming from the procurement space, a lot of these providers we consider very strategic suppliers, and the relationship is important. And I know that many of the clients I talk to don't want to do things where they go in and they just negotiate hard and cut margins of the providers. But I think it's important to look at how the margins of those providers are doing. In many cases, they're doing just fine. But also to look at these bigger win-win changes that are a little more long-lasting to the partnership. Abhishek, do you want to talk about some of the trends you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Amy. So again, you know, optimization can get you to a certain point, can get clients to a certain level of benefits realization. But you know, if I may, the real meat and the real change comes in once you start thinking about transformation, structural changes as to the ways of working. Now, one of the things which often impacts any structural change is, hey, who takes on the risk? That's risky. It needs investment in technology, effort, change management, all of that. Some of it remains endemic within the client. It has to be, right? Things like change management. But having said that, we've seen providers become much more open to taking on risks in order to maintain competitiveness without a rate haircut. Right? So this is the motion we're seeing. You know, client reaches out, hey, I need cost savings, get it down by 15%, 20%. Clearly, the answer is that we can't reduce the 15-20% without changing anything, right? But having said, you know, there are some ideas where we can help look at a win-win, right? So, you know, providers being open to taking on some of that risk, we've seen it for the past many years, as we call skin in the game. There's multiple kind of, you know, partnership approaches, etc. In the past 6 months, this seems to have taken on a new meaning, and I'll share some examples which we've highlighted. You know, in a few cases, we've actually seen that and this may be more relevant for business services, fully variable digital FTEs. So in a typical BPO model, whenever there's more automation to be implemented, there's a certain cost outlay, there's a certain level of investment which needs to be made, and then that gets recovered over time, etc. And then financial engineering can be done, but effectively some amount of investment, some amount of time, some amount of setup will need to be happening from the client side as well, right? And they'll have to pay for it, right? Now, what we're seeing is that many service providers have now started offering a very variabilized approach that, hey, everything gets set up by the service provider. Over time, as each human FTE gets replaced by digital FTEs, right, the cost reduces from that month onwards, right? So if the human FTE is, random example, $4,000 a month, the digital FTE equivalent cost of a month is $1,500. So that benefit starts realizing from that point onward. So it keeps things very clear. It keeps things aligned, very easy to understand, as opposed to, hey, I need to set something up pretty fast. Right? Some of those elements we're also seeing in front-loading transformation benefits. Some deals which had committed transformation benefits have hey, something which would need to be realized in 2021 or 2022, they've now been baked into 2020 financials, especially for some clients like oil and gas, travel firms, which are really, really, which got hit by the pandemic very bad, very early. And then there's some other elements like, proofs of concept, time investments, especially for consulting-esque kind of resources within service providers. So rather than wait for them to be billable or work on large projects, they're being sent out to make way, for the new normal, so to speak. Think about processes, etc., without really a huge financial impact on the client, right? So just to keep them utilized and increase penetration within a client. The final thing I'd mention is that, there's also, in some cases, we've seen partial revenue deferred or linked to outcomes. I won't see this as truly transformational, right? It's less about linked to the service or impact versus about weathering the storm. So we've seen cases where, hey, we can't give you a discount, but subject to these conditions, you can pay us this amount of the fee once you get back to this kind of a normal revenue stream, etc. Right? Now, obviously, there are ifs and buts and conditions around that, but that's just more about staggering the revenue flow rather than a pure outcome-based price. A few minutes ago, I spoke about SLAs, service level agreements, and this is where the next page comes into play. We need to realize that there's nothing like a free lunch. Everything comes at a cost. In many cases, we've seen that at the start of an engagement, when there's little or no insight into the provider, the trust hasn't been built, clients may push for a very, very strong SLA level, right? 5 nines availability, all calls answered within 20 seconds, right? Everything. And now over time, what happens is that, that need doesn't get reduced. The comfort available means that, hey, that's fine, right? I'm comfortable even if it's, a couple of notches lower. Now, a couple of notches lower actually may mean that there's no visible impact on user experience. But from a cost perspective, it could make a significant impact to how the service provider staffs and runs its operations. Right? So we've actually seen that the range between the typical SLA targets and stringent SLA targets could be as high as 5 to 7%, and similarly between typical and lenient is another 5 to 7%. So we're looking at a span or a spread of 10 to 14%, which can be tweaked just by moving around the SLAs a bit, right? And that could actually be a lever in today's, especially for some companies which are really troubled, to see how can they really optimize, even if it's on a temporary basis for a couple of years, to relook at their SLAs and make sure that, hey, the price would go down, but also this means that the cost of delivering for the vendor goes down. So you're not hitting on the vendor's margin. It's a revenue impact, which is much more palatable than both a revenue and a margin. So I think this is something very important, which we recommend organizations should look at, once at least 12 to 18 months, even if it's a cursory review, to understand, do we really need this metric, or do we really need this high stringency? Just changing gears, very quickly from some of the elements around specific SLAs or specific levers. One of the things we're also seeing is contract simplification and pricing model restructure. Now, these are pretty macro elements, so to speak. Okay. Over a number of years, provider portfolios have grown in a rather uncontrolled way. Enterprises are looking to rationalize them to drive benefits of simplification, standardization, of course, with the intent to reduce the associated governance overhead, right? And of course, as part of that, pricing models too are being reviewed to be able to deliver the best risk reward mix, right? So, on the contract simplification, in fact, we ourselves have worked on a number of recent engagements to really, simplify, standardize elements like service credit regime, productivity improvement, right? Ongoing improvements. That was a concern highlighted in the poll as well a few minutes ago. Volume-based discounts, etc. And it's sometimes surprising that in otherwise pretty well-run organizations, contracts seem to be all over the place in terms of how their terms are structured. Pricing model is a topic which generates a lot of debate, and more so very passionate debate, because clients have either been super successful or many have really burnt their fingers, and it's no surprise. So Enterprises now, we see enterprise procurement overall is now even the businesses have become much more mature and smart in terms of, which pricing model to opt for and how to recalibrate. Right? So there's no one single answer. Hey, let's move to output. Let's move to outcome based. It doesn't work. There are many manifestations which need to be kept in mind to be able to make that move. So again, ensuring a methodical approach which really blends the characteristics like complexity, predictability, volume forecasting. There's a lot of factors which need to go into play, but a lot of these things are being restructured in a very mature and balanced way, so to speak. The loss lever I'll talk about, which again is another hot topic for discussion, automation. Right? Now, let me just play out a scenario. Automation business case, check. Automation savings delivered, check. Right? Okay. A lot of clients have actually gained automation-related savings. Now, what really causes an issue sometimes and we've seen this with a lot of enterprises across geographies, across industries, across maturity levels, is the clarity and transparency on how that has been factored in. That is a major gap in here. So we've seen, for example, opacity in terms of what the net impact has been due to the ongoing and automation-related productivity. Where we're doing a strategic engagement review, the service provider side or supplier side says, well, we've been impacted this much and that much, and X million dollars of savings have been delivered. Where the client says, well, I guess so, but I really don't have any clarity or I can't say for sure how that's done. And the main reason is that, the simplicity of articulation, and this is more for the service provider side, is missing, right? So a very simple way could be what percentage of FTE and dollar impact comes from what lever, and what's unconditionally committed and what's subject to dependencies, right? So some of that really, really helps simplify the message, right? And as contracts get overhauled, this should be the norm to be really made clear with the provider that, hey, don't just confuse me with an overall lump sum number, right? I want to know what part is driving what kind of savings, right? And we're seeing a lot of providers actually being very mature and putting that out very, very clearly in their proposals, unfortunately, as to how they would define it. Unfortunately, when it gets to contracting and execution, it again gets lumped up into a lump sum, which causes issues during renewal. Just to quickly summarize, in terms of what I've just discussed, right? Three things. One, I guess before embarking on any outsourced price calibration, really critical to understand how the current piece stacks up. Prioritize the ones where the scope appears to be have the maximum juice in it, right? Don't look at just the one which is already competitively priced and browbeat them. Right? That's not the way to go. As a thumb rule, we've seen that legacy contracts, i.e. the ones which have been signed for the past, which have been in place for the past 7, 8, 10 years, just being renewed without any competition, they tend to have more bloat in them, more opportunity to squeeze out the juice. And then finally, it's advisable to think beyond just the unit price rate cards, right? I think an ostensibly competitive rate card may be hiding significant inefficiencies. So very important to take that holistically. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you, Abhishek. Great stuff. So I think that prioritization is a really good point at the end there. So I want to take a pause here. One of the things that we want to offer is a services labor rate check. This is something that we kind of put together for those in the ANZ market working with Beaconfield. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a very large price database, and we find it helpful for people to just get kind of a taste and do a complimentary rate price check. So there will be a link, or there we go, a quick poll, thank you. And you can click if you'd like to be contacted on this. I think we'll have another link at the end, most likely, or in the chat as well. And we will connect you with one of our analysts. Will let you are able to, sorry, I lost that slide, but you're able to select from 3 roles in 6 countries. There's a drop down of the roles in that form that you'll get, and then you can choose from Australia, China, India, Philippines, UK, or United States. And feel free to reply now, or you can always follow us up after with us to take this. But what you'll get back is a report. There's the countries again, report with the rates and a conversation with someone on Abhishek's team who can help you to understand how to interpret the data. And I see that that link is in the chat now, so feel free to click that as well. Even if you took the poll, you can save yourself the step and just fill it out before we're done. I've seen these rate checks. I think they're a really helpful way to just get a quick temperature of the market versus your rates. And with that, we want to kind of wrap up here, and I see a bunch of questions, so I want to make sure we have enough time for the questions. Just to circle back, you know, as we said earlier, and as Abhishek pointed out, most of the enterprise sourcing portfolios that we work with, that we've looked at, have multiple sources of value leakage that can be addressed. There is data, there are tactics, there are solutions to help you reach the savings that you're looking for. Let me throw it back to Abhishek just for the last minute or two here of slides to talk a little bit about what he's seen in terms of price benchmarking efforts and how that's helped. Abhishek, you still there?
My apologies, I was on mute. So yeah, what we've discussed till now, thanks Amy, is steeped in reality, right? So enterprise clients have seen significant benefits in rather short time frames from these kinds of efforts. You know, really looking at their overall commercials, and this always makes these efforts self-funding in a very short period of time. Let me just talk about one of the examples, right? We supported a life sciences major on a sole source, relatively mid-size proposal validation. They wanted to get, it was a carve out from a large pharma company. They wanted to get into their contract very quickly. Within a span of 3 weeks, because it wasn't a competitive process and they had no way to figure out if they were paying the right price or they were entering into it correctly, the client was able to use market relevant facts to drive down the fee overall sustainably by an annualized 2.2 million, right? So effectively, you know, within 1 month, that client got a 20x return on investment, right? Even if we count only 1 year's worth of savings, right? So that's the power of some of this, that savings are instantaneous. It's not some intangible element which comes up years later, right? So so again, you know, yet in another example that there were savings found in pockets, even within a large, sophisticated portfolio of contact center services. This is for one of the top 5 technology companies in the world. And that major got a 42x return on investment, even though it was a pretty well negotiated set of contracts to start with, right? So that's something which we just wanted to leave on the table.
Thanks, Abhishek. And with that, we're going to start going through the questions. I do want to do one quick just overview of some of the things Everest Group does and the way that we work with enterprises in terms of the membership programs we have and that we partner with Beaconfield on, as well as some of the projects that they do. And there's a number of ways we work together to support our clients mutually. We have an outsourcing excellence program that's focused on market intelligence around services categories, including IT services, business process services, contingent workforce, tech engineering, things like that. And we cover provider portfolio and really deep versions of the vision into the market, risk rating, solution design, things like that. We also have a pricing as a service membership, which gives you access to the kinds of price benchmarks that we've mentioned a couple times on an ongoing basis. So it's a bit of a retainer and access to data as the market changes. And that's been something that's become very popular over the last 6 months or so. And a number of projects here as well. So I just want to encourage people as we get through the questions to reach out to Tom or the Beaconfield team if you have questions or interests or need that we can help you with. Let me switch back and we'll go through the questions now. Abhishek, I think this is a good one for you. Are there any pricing models offered by service providers, such as a revenue share model or any innovative models that can benefit enterprises, especially in the end user computing space? And I think you mentioned a little bit on this, but maybe you can touch a bit deeper on the innovative models that you're seeing.
Yeah, so I think one of the things which often comes up is, hey, linked to outcomes or revenue share or business generated. You know, a bit of a sobering thought, not just a bit of a caveat here. Right? Where we've seen such models be successful is in very specific cases where the service is directly linked or impacting the business, right, outcome. Right? For example, sourcing and category management, right? Procurement outsourcing. Clearly, the revenues or the payment is linked to the kind of savings. So very clear linkage. There are other elements which are around outbound contact center, right, or outbound sales, or utilities related recovery, right, which could be related to how much delinquency you've recovered. You get a share. Very clear. Now, when it comes to things like end user compute space, right, that's actually a very a service which is totally linked to driving the internal operations of a company rather than anything linked to the revenue generated. Right? So having said that, we haven't seen anything around anything as innovative, so to speak, as revenue share model or as aggressive as that. Having, you know, one thing which we are seeing is where a lot of benefit can come through, right, is a few things. One, moving the pricing from like a per ticket or per FTE of service delivery employee to something like a per user basis, right? And then, so what that does is that it's totally linked to how your business scales up or down, and you pay accordingly. It's not that, hey, there's a sudden ticket surge and you end up paying thousands of dollars that month unnecessarily. Right? So that helps you keep the prices in control. Where the real value comes in, right, is that while contracting, there's got to be an effort and a committed ongoing improvement plan articulated by the service provider as to how they will take the per user delivered or per user end user support cost from X to Y over 5 years. And that's like committed. It's a glide path, right? So that really, you know, comes from things like which will be implemented like self-serve, things like you know, better provisioning, way more efficient operations in terms of service desk handling, a lot of automated you know, insta alerts and self-healing, etc. So what that does is that incentivizes, because pricing models are one thing we have to remember, and I always tell my clients, pricing models are to drive the right supplier behavior. They're not a panacea by themselves, right? So this per user basis, it drives the service provider to think that, hey, I'm going to get the same amount or a certain glide path amount per user. How can I really make it so efficient that I'm meeting the quality considerations, I'm meeting the experience metrics, but at the same time, it doesn't cost me 10 people to just do something mundane. So that's something which we're seeing, which is innovative, which is around a clear path reduction over time to get to a much lower end user compute.
Thanks, Abhishek. Great points. I'm going to throw it over to Tom and just see if he's got any examples from the ANZ market, and then he can kind of close this out because we're got just a few minutes left.
Absolutely. So, you know, certainly the comments that Abhishek made are things we're seeing here. You know, there's a general move to more outcome pricing. We also see the you know, on the call center side, especially some of the revenue sharing models are very, very common, and certainly happy to talk more about those after the call with anyone. But the one thing, and especially given the questions you had earlier about the need to drive innovation, especially in the government context, what we've been adding into a lot of the contracts lately in Australia is gain sharing around innovation. So, you know, Abhishek made a very observant comment earlier that, you know, the service providers are very, you know, are not very forthcoming all the time in saving their efficiencies with a client, especially over a, you know, long-term deal. So what we've done very successfully, and I know some of you on the call have worked with us on this, but we've done very successfully is we've tied gain share to innovation. And I think that's, that's something that's becoming more and more common. So certainly plenty of options. There's a lot going on in this area, but there's some real concrete examples in the government context where we've tied the at least a share of the vendor's revenue to how it does on innovation.
That's a great point. Thanks, Tom. I think we've got just a minute left, so maybe we just wrap up now. I know there's a couple other questions, but we can always try to reach out to people after as well and answer those individually.
Great. Well, from our perspective at Beaconfield, we are grateful that you had the time to join us for today. Hopefully, you've found it insightful. I've been watching the guests, so not a lot of people have dropped off. So I think we've hit the mark for most of you. But certainly, this is a great opportunity for us to introduce our partnership with Everest, and absolutely, happy to take any follow-up questions or calls after this. My email is shown here. It certainly can help here locally, but I would say don't hesitate to contact Abhishek or Amy as well. And we will be doing quite a bit of follow-up from this call, including having the replay available for any of your colleagues that you'd like to share some of this with. And with that, back to you, Amy.
Thank you, and I think we are all set. We'll close it out. Appreciate everybody joining. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.